So welcome to the second lecture. So we're going to be basically talking about how you generate research ideas. And this is specific to not only a broad concept of how we come up with research ideas when we're wanting to study psychology as a science, but also very specifically kind of focusing on how to generate ideas for the research that you're going to do in this class. And I want to talk about that first. So again, you'll be going into a lot more detail with this as you get into your groups this Friday as a part of the lab exercises. But broadly speaking, what you're going to be accomplishing in the labs in this class over the next 8 weeks is to basically come up with a research idea. And we're making it fairly easy to do. Most research ideas, and again, going from Monday's lecture, are looking for the relationships between variables, and we're going to be handing you one of those variables. So one of the variables you're going to be looking at is job satisfaction. And job satisfaction is a construct, so it's a psychological construct, and that, again, we're going to get into that in more detail in this class, but that basically means that it is something that we can ask people about, we can put it on a scale, we can measure it, so we can say someone is dissatisfied with their job, we can say someone's meh, they really don't care one way or the other, or someone's very satisfied with the job that they have. And there's ways to measure that fairly consistently. So a variable is something that varies on a numerical scale. So job satisfaction, depending on the scale, can vary from a low number to a high number, low being less job satisfaction, high being more job satisfaction. So that part of the research idea is preset in this class. You'll be given access to the article that goes over what job satisfaction is and creates a scale, and that's the scale you'll use when you create your data. Your task as a group is to come up with a variable that you think would be related to job satisfaction. So what we're going to be doing in this class as a part of the lab and kind of also as a focus on applying the skills we're learning in lectures is a correlational study. And a correlational study is looking for the relationship between two variables that vary, one of those being job satisfaction. You need to come up with something that you think would be related to job satisfaction, a psychological construct that can be measured. Once you have that, you're then going to do a lit review. You're going to look for research on job satisfaction. You're going to look for research on the variable that your group chose. And you're also going to see if there's anything out there that's already looked at the relationship between the two. You're going to use that lit review to kind of guide your study and to guide what you're wanting to look at. You're then going to write a method section, and that method section is going to be basically discussing if you had run this experiment or were going to run this experiment with live participants, what would be that process? What would they experience? Who would your sample be? And what materials would you use? And one of those materials obviously would be this job satisfaction survey, but you would also describe the materials that you would use to measure whatever you're interested in that you think is related to job satisfaction. Then as a part of lab, you're going to create a data set. So we're not going to actually collect data. We're going to basically create a data set, and we'll go over how to do that in lab. And then once we have that data set of basically fake or canned data, we're going to go ahead and use that to run your analyses. You'll then use that analyses once you've ran it to write your results section, and from the results section you'll write your discussion section, and we're going to be walking you through this whole process. So at the end of the 8 weeks, not only will you done a faux or a fake experiment from start to finish, you'll also have an APA research paper from start to finish, and that's really one of the goals of this class. Because one of the ways to really learn how to do something is to do it. And that's what we're wanting you to do, because a part of being a psychologist and a part of getting the degree in psychology is also understanding psychological research. And what better way to understand how research is done than to do it yourself? So that's just a broad overview of what you'll be using this information for when you generate your own research ideas. Now, we're also going to be doing a second CAN study next semester, which you'll have a little more control over. And we're probably going to be using an archival data set, which means real data, but not data that we collected to do that. Anyway, we'll talk about that more obviously with the next class. So moving on from what we're doing in this class and what we're doing in the lab section this Friday, let's also talk about generating research ideas broadly. From where do research ideas come from when scientists are looking at human behavior? So again, I want to contrast that all science really is, at the end of the day, is a much more rigorous and methodological set of tools that we're applying to what most people do naturally. So generally, common sense, or just how we behave in the real world outside of science, is we tend to generalize from only a few cases. And this makes a lot of sense behaviorally. If you actually used as an individual the scientific method to decide if mushrooms, a particular type of mushroom for instance, was truly dangerous and could kill you, you would probably lose a lot of your group to figure that out. So generally speaking, we have learned as a species to generalize very quickly. If you see something that looks like fire and smells like fire, and you've never encountered fire before, and you reach your hand into it and it burns and wounds you, you're not going to keep looking for fires and keep putting your hand in until you have enough cases to where you are 100% absolutely sure fire is hot and hot burns. You're going to generalize maybe from that single case and never touch fire again. That is not a bad plan, but that's not necessarily science. And in fact, what we know is that a lot of people do generalize, and that allows a lot of stage magicians to do some fairly impressive stuff with things that look like fire, are technically fire, but are burning at a temperature that doesn't do damage. And therefore, it looks like they're doing amazing feats with what most of us assume is a dangerous object, fire. So we usually generalize from only a few cases. And once we have our preconceptions, we tend to observe selectively. We see what we're looking for. Probably one of the best ways to talk about this, at least in my mind, is if you've ever bought a new car, you probably suddenly start noticing that car. So for instance, I really didn't pay attention to anything but the broad category of truck before I owned a truck. So before I owned a truck, there were trucks, and all trucks were the same, and I really didn't pay any attention to them. But then when I bought a truck, now I start to know at least what my truck is, and I started to notice, wow, it looks like about half the trucks out here are the same truck that I bought. That means I'm looking for it now, and suddenly I'm noticing it. And that's also what happens with common sense, is once we've made up our mind about a group, we tend to discount information that doesn't support it. In other words, I wasn't necessarily looking and going, oh, there's a Ford, oh, there's a Ford, oh, there's a Ford, oh, there's a Chevy, there's a Chevy. I was ignoring Fords and Chevys. I was attending to Dodge Rams because that's what I bought. So it's like truck, 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 ooh, cool, a Dodge Ram. Truck, 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 ooh, cool, a Dodge Ram. So I would get the perception, and in fact, I found myself thinking, it looks like everyone's bought Dodge Rams. And this is where the scientist in me came out. I actually caught myself doing this right after I bought my truck. And on one particularly long trip, I actually just put a little sheet of paper next to the car where I was driving and wrote Chevy, Ford, Dodge, other. And just every time I passed a truck, I'd mark it down. And at the end of the day, it actually turned out there were more Fords on the road than Dodge Rams. But again, that's not what I was looking for. And the final thing is we tend to make up things to fill in the gaps. And what I mean by that is that when we're using our common sense, we're living our lives, we're gathering this information, we're objectively selecting to look for information that already supports our beliefs. And if we're not 100% sure, we tend to fill in the gaps. In other words, we tend to not question minor inconsistencies, we simply fill it in. And a good example of this actually, and we'll talk about this actually a little bit later in this particular slide set, is that when you encounter something that you're familiar with, you tend to fill in the gaps. And what I mean by that, for example, is that if you go into a professor's office, before you ever go into that office, you have a conception of what a professor's office looks like. It probably includes that there's a degree on the wall. It may include that there's a few personal items on the desk, and it probably includes at least a bookshelf or a filing cabinet, and probably a fair amount of what look to be fairly dry academic books. Potentially also a couple shelves full of journals. That's what my perception is. Probably a computer. My perception would include a computer with two screens because I've always used two screens on all the computers that I've used for work. If you go into someone's office, though, you're probably not putting a lot of memory into reminding yourself what the office itself looked like. You're focused on the meeting with the professor involved. When you leave, if someone asks you the next day, what did that office look like? And by the way, this is an actual experiment I'm describing. They actually did this. You have a high tendency to fill in the gaps. In other words, almost always you'd mention, well, there was a degree on the wall, whether there was or not. You almost always will say there was books on the shelves, whether there was or not. And how this was an experiment is they actually did for an entire semester, a group of professors basically made sure that their offices were missing certain key items. So some people took down their degrees, some people removed all the books, And they basically varied what the offices looked like to where every office was missing at least one key stereotypical item you would expect to find in a professor's office. They then, anytime any student asked to have office hours, they gave them a little slip of paper and said, hey, do you mind actually reviewing my office hours next week, tomorrow? There'll be a link that'll go live. When they went to the link, they were asked to remember the office, and they looked at those differences, and they actually found, for example, that most people did fill in the gaps. Some people did attend to the differences. Not everyone, but some people did. But the majority of people described a stereotypical office, even if it wasn't. Science goes one step further. It's a set of methodological tools that explicitly samples for generalization. In other words, we're not generalizing from a few cases, and I just gave you that example. Common sense was me going, I notice a lot of trucks around. Look, there are a lot of them are the ones I expect them to be, the new truck that I bought. Explicitly sampling was when I put myself to the test. I specifically chose a day when I'd get an exposure to a large number of trucks. I was driving all day long, and I actually tried to find a sample that would generalize how many trucks are actually on the road. I conscientiously decide what and how to observe. So instead of just kind of attending and not thinking about it, I created a little coding guide based on the manufacturer. And finally, I based my conclusions on the evidence, not my gut feeling. So the example of my gut feeling about trucks versus an experiment about trucks kind of illustrates this difference. But whenever we're doing science, we want to go through explicitly asking ourselves, what is our sample? How are we getting it? And is that sample going to allow us to make a generalization to the larger population, if you will, so people that we didn't sample? We would consciously decide what and how we're observing, and that's often what the method section of a paper is. And finally, once we've gathered the data from the sample we've chosen, using the methods that we've decided, we now want to base our conclusions only on that evidence, and we want to make sure that we conduct ourselves with that evidence, the statistical analysis, properly. So this entire class was just summed down by those 3 points. How do we pick out our samples? How do we pick out our methods? And how do we run the data once we have it? That's pretty much the core of Psych 220. So for the rest of this lecture, I'm really just going to kind of do a scatter shot of famous studies. And really the reason I'm going over these studies is to kind of show you some examples of cool ideas that came out from people trying to come up with how do I research various human behavior? And how do I take the idea of what I'm wanting to research and actually operationalize it into a study? So the first study I'm going to talk about is what motivates children's attachment to the mother. So the broad idea here was wanting to study attachment of human children to mothers. So what is actually the result? What causes children to form, basically infants, a strong attachment to their mother? What is the components of it, and can it be broken down? So that's the broad question. How they decided to initially operationalize this was a further question. Is it the warmth and comfort that a mother provides, or is it the food? And you have to realize that when this study was conducted, there was a strong movement in psychology towards behavioralism, the idea that all human behavior is simply a response to stimuli. And based on that, this was a question of what is the more important stimuli, a feeling of warmth and comfort or a feeling of food? And how they actually conducted this was, instead of using human infants, so thinking back to that ethics lecture we talked about, where in the 20s and 30s psychologists would go get orphans, this was in the 50s and 60s, they decided to use monkeys. And in this particular study, what they did is they took infant monkeys at a very young age, and they basically provided them with 2 potential mothers. One of them was simply a wire frame that provided food. The other one did not provide food, but had a heater inside and was covered in a soft fur. They also put on a kind of a funky, scary face versus a slightly more warm and friendly face on these 2 actual constructs, as you can see in the picture. And what they found was that the infants spent almost the entirety of their 24-hour day on the supportive, quote-unquote supportive, soft fur-covered warmth mother, and only left that mother for the milk when hunger demanded it. And based on this study, we started to realize that maybe it wasn't just a food response, that the actual formation of attachment, an important part of that was the actual contact, the comfort. And though this seems like a very basic experiment, from this experiment, a large amount was learned, and many other experiments started to look at what is the relationship between initial attachment with infants and mothers. So changing gears very quickly to a completely separate field and a completely different study. So the one we just talked about, basically the attachment with mothers, is an example of a true experiment. And what I mean by true experiment is completely controlled. So it was a lab setting. There was nothing else that could distract the infant. The infant was taken at a very early age with very little experience and presented with two potential stimuli, a food stimuli and a comfort stimuli. And then the outcome of that study was how much time did they spend with each stimuli. So that is an example of a very rigorous study, but you could also ask, does that really generalize to human infants? And that's a valid question. This next study actually is an example of a very much a field study and a practical study that looked at a workplace setting. And that was that poker will help make sure that you show up on work on time. And again, the broad question from this study was, how do you motivate workers to be more attentive to showing up on time? In other words, how do you apply what psychology knows about motivation and human behavior to actually simply adjust human behavior on a work site? And what this was specifically, this was a practical project where a logging company contacted a couple of industrial organizational psychologists and said, we have a problem. And the problem is that the work site is almost 2 hours away from where our workers come in. So they come in their own vehicles, they arrive, and then the bus leaves at a certain time. If someone's late, either A, the bus has to wait for them to make sure we have as many workers as we can, or B, they're at least 4 hours late to work because the bus leaves, takes the workers that are there, and 4 hours later, 2 hours there, 2 hours back, comes and can get anyone that showed up late. By the time they get to work, they tend to actually get only about 4 hours of work in before it's time to leave. So we need to make sure that our workers are always on time. This is costing us an enormous amount of money. And what the psychologists did was they did a lit review. They looked at past research on motivation. They also looked at a lot of past research on behavioral modification. And what they came up with was a simple idea, a very simple bonus based on a poker hand. So it was a 5-day work week. Every day that you showed up for work on time, you randomly got a poker card, and you got to keep that with your work kit. At the end of the week, if you got all 5 cards, whoever had the best poker hand won $100. Now remember, the company was losing thousands a day due to absenteeism, so they were 100% happy with the idea that they had to spend 55 cents on a deck of cards and $100 a week if it got people to show up on time. And indeed, it worked perfectly almost. They went from almost a 30% absentee rate every day to less than 5% within a week, and they continue to maintain the system. So this is an example of, again, applying a broad concept, behavioral modification, to a very specific sample to solve a real-world problem. So some additional just kind of interesting studies. The fact that you can predict SAT scores from how many marshmallows you took when you were 6 years old. So this was a study that was looking at actually trying to operationalize the idea of internal versus external motivation, and also whether or not an important factor in human development was a personality concept of basically being able to wait for rewards. In other words, basically having the ability to have patience. And the way they operationalized this broad concept was with a marshmallow test. They would bring in a small child, about 6 years old on average, and other experiments used other ages. And they would basically tell the child, I have a marshmallow on the table, and the child would see the large stuffed marshmallow. I have to go and do something else in the other room. If I come back and that marshmallow is still here, I will give you a second marshmallow. However, when I come back, if that marshmallow is gone, that's the only one you get. You don't get the second one. And they basically just did this with child after child after child after child. A very simple experiment. Some children took the marshmallow. Some children didn't. Some children were somewhere in between, but they either managed to make it through or they didn't. So basically, you kind of had 3 broad categories of kids. Some kids took the marshmallow the second the person left the room. This would be people with very little self-control, very little patience. Some children gladly just waited. Very patiently for the entire time, and then when the person got back, they got the 2 marshmallows. And then a lot of kids fell in somewhere between where they basically were very distraught. They were wanting to take the marshmallow, but they were stopping themselves. They were trying to distract themselves from the marshmallows. And some of them made it the time limit, some of them didn't and ate the marshmallow. But at the end of the day, at the end of the experiment, they broke them into the two groups. People that managed to wait and got the 2 marshmallows, and people that didn't and only got the 1. For the second part of the experiment, they then waited for about 10 to 12 years for all of the people that had been in that experiment to get old enough to take SAT scores. And then after the SAT scores, they waited another 10 years and looked at overall success. So they were asking, can the number of marshmallows you took, either you took one quickly, no self-control, or you waited for the second marshmallow, higher self-control, predict long-term outcomes of those people's lives? And the answer was, it did. There was a statistically significant difference in SAT scores. So the people that waited and got the 2 marshmallows scored much higher, had better GPAs, tended to go to college more often, and also tended to have better jobs than the kids that grabbed the immediate marshmallow. Now, based on this study, some of you might be thinking, Dr. Nadler, you have a child. Did you do the marshmallow test with your kid? I did. When he was 6 years old, that marshmallow was immediately eaten. I couldn't even get out of the room before he chowed it down. He's done fairly well in school, but every time he brings back a less than stellar grade, I just look at him, shake my head, and go, 1 marshmallow. Anyway, moving on to another study. Will people defend territory that has no value? So the idea here, the broad idea they started with, is we want to research basically how do humans value things that no longer have value to them. In other words, the perception here was based on individuals who were thinking, how do you explain behavior, especially when it looks like people are doing things that make no sense, to defend things that aren't even theirs? So that was kind of the initial thought, and the way they operationalized this was they basically just set up cameras on a campus parking lot. And what they were looking for is basically they were looking for a couple of variables. So anytime someone approached their car, they basically they were watching the videos of this afterwards. So they'd get the videos of the parking lot, and then they just examine those videos. And for every time someone went to their parked car to basically leave, they would clock between when they opened the front door to when the car fully cleared the parking lot. And that was their outcome variable. How long did it take you to leave the parking lot? The variable that they were interested in was whether or not someone was waiting for that spot. So they would mark either yes or no. There was no one waiting for the spot. How long did it take you to leave? There was someone waiting for the spot. How long did it take you to leave? Now notice that the parking spot has no value to anyone at this point. The value to it was when you were looking for it. You're now leaving. You don't need it anymore. It has no value. And what they found in this particular study was, indeed, when someone was waiting for your parking spot, people significantly took longer to leave the parking spot. Now, you could start to argue, well, how do you know whether they were making a call or whether they were having to find their keys? That's quite possible. Every individual, it may be a little different. But they collected enough data, hundreds of cars and hundreds of parking lots, that probably should have averaged out to where the people that were just delaying because of other reasons would also have been just delaying when someone wasn't waiting for them. So by getting a large enough sample, they started to address any of the questions we could have, and they showed that we as a species, on average, tend to put value on protecting things that we don't even need anymore. So it's, again, an interesting little kind of snapshot into human behavior. So let's talk about some more operationalizations and some interesting findings from both social and cognitive psychology. So for example, people will enjoy stuffing envelopes more when they're paid $1 an hour than if they're paid $20 an hour. Well, this is basically the start of the concept of cognitive dissonance. And this is really an interesting study because this is an example of a whole series of studies that a lot of times aren't talked about. The actual initial research question was about doomsday cults. So the researcher involved here actually was interested in researching basically the sunk costs, if you will, of joining a doomsday cult. And the question that seemed to occur to them is they first wanted to just examine how do doomsday cults work. And how they did this was they faked joining one. They pretended that they were interested in a cult, they found one, and they joined it. And then they basically just were ethnographers, if you will. In other words, they were basically more like sociologists, just observing a group that they had joined. And what they found was that this was a doomsday cult. In other words, it was a cult that said, on this date, the world will end, and that's why you need to join us. Well, the date rolled around, and of course, the world didn't end. And what they found was very interesting because the vast majority of the people that were in the cult actually became more committed after the failure. And that's what got them thinking, why would people who had joined a cult whose entire concept is the world will end, and they find out that the cult is wrong, and then they still stay in the cult? That then brought them to wanting to do an actual in the lab experiment on this. And the way they designed or operationalized this is they were basically wanting to ask, if you commit to something, if we get you to publicly state that you support something, will it actually change your beliefs? In other words, this is a theory that action is more important, or behaviors are more important than internal feelings. Not necessarily that they aren't separate concepts, but the idea that if you are forced into a behavior, it's easier to change your attitudes after you've done the behavior than it is to change the behavior after it's done. In other words, you do a behavior, it's done. You can't change it, but you can change your attitude about it. So what they basically did was they brought in people into an experiment, and there was basically, the experiment was always the same. It was an incredibly long and boring task. You were stuffing envelopes in a very meticulous way, in a way that actually didn't make a lot of sense, and it was a boring task, it wasn't enjoyable, and you had to do it for an hour. At the end of the experiment, so they had done this for an hour, the variation was basically every single time they were said, hey, I was supposed to have someone to tell the next person that this study was really fun. Are you willing to do that for me? And if the person said yes, they were then asked to lie and say that the study was actually very fun to the next participant. Now, here's the kicker. So everyone did the boring task. Everyone was asked to basically tell the next person that it was a fun task. Afterwards, they were then thanked for lying by either being paid $1 or being paid $20. Now, at the time of this experiment, $1 was worth about $5 or $6. So basically, they were being paid, think of it as a Big Mac meal, to lie. $20 was equivalent to about $150 today. So in that case, think of it as they were being offered a decent-sized TV for lying. Now, what was interesting was 2 days later, they were contacted and asked how fun was the activity they did. And remember, this was an incredibly unpleasant activity. The people that had paid $1, in other words, a Big Mac, basically rated it as much higher, much more fun than the people that were paid $20. And the idea, once they found this, and basically this is the idea of cognitive dissonance, was this is what was going on in people's minds. I'm being asked if it was fun. I was only paid $1 to lie to someone. That means I didn't make a lot of money to lie for them. And I don't feel very good about lying, but I already did it. I already took the $1, I already lied. Maybe it wasn't as bad as I thought it was. There's where the rub is. Now, at the $20 an hour, people knew why they lied. Yes, I lied. It wasn't fun, but I know why I lied. I lied for a heck of a lot of money. And that's the idea behind cognitive dissonance, that when we can't change a behavior, if there's no other excuse for that behavior, we have a tendency to actually change our attitude. And that was also then reflected back into their original research on doomsday cults. They thought back, that's what was happening. I've already devoted my entire life to this cult. I've told all my friends and family I would never talk to them again. I sold all my earthly belongings and gave it to this cult. I can't go back and admit that it's a mistake right now. And if the leader says, oh, we got the date wrong, it's actually going to end in 2 years, I really don't have a lot of choice but to believe it at this point, because sunk costs, I'm all in. Now, if someone had just joined the cult, hadn't given away items yet, hadn't told anyone they were in the cult, those people left immediately when the cult was wrong. It was the people that had done the hefty commitment and couldn't come up with another reason why they had gone into the cult at that point. And that's the idea of cognitive dissonance. Another study basically started from observations of college professors that noticed that people tended to perform better when they were in similar situations. So if you've ever heard of the concept of home court advantage, that people tend to play a little bit better on the practice field that they practice on, there actually is some reality to this, and that's what they put it to the test. This is basically an experimental test of the home field advantage. And there's a lot of variations in this study. This study has been done in many, many ways, but the very initial study was basically people were brought in and they were basically given enough alcohol to either be drunk or they were given enough non-alcoholic beverages to at least equal the same feeling without the actual alcoholic content. So basically everyone drank the same amount, but half the participants were drunk by the time they were done, half of them weren't. They were then given a lecture on brand new information that none of them had ever heard before. Now, so we have two conditions. We have people that have learned drunk, and we've had people that haven't learned drunk. A week later, they're brought in and again randomly assigned to either get drunk or not get drunk. And then they're given a test on the material. And what they found was that if you had learned sober and were tested sober, you did very, very well. If you learned drunk and were tested drunk, you did decent. But if you learned drunk and were tested sober, or learned sober and tested drunk, you did the poorest of all. We do have a tendency to learn things in context. Even though we're not paying attention to the temperature, to our mental state, to the room we're in, when we're tested in a similar space, we actually tend to perform slightly better. Now, this is a minor effect, but it's definitely there. I still remember one of the ways I applied this, and this is not exactly the most politically correct story, but years ago I had a student that every time he came to lecture, he'd walk into the class, I would see him have a nervous reaction, he would walk back out of the class and go into the men's room right next door. He would then come back 5 minutes later, usually slightly into the lecture, but usually on the first slide, and he'd sit in the dead center of class, and I can tell you by smell, he was going to the bathroom to smoke marijuana, no question. He did this every single time, every lecture. When the first test came around, he came in and sat down. I took a whiff, no marijuana, and I was waiting for him to go to the bathroom. He didn't. And I actually came over and said, so I'm just curious, you normally go to the bathroom afterwards. Yeah, but the test is too important. I'm not going to do it this time. And I kind of just leaned in and went, psychological science says you should. He didn't. He did pretty poorly on the test. On the final, he actually went to the bathroom, came back smelling a pot, and did better. So there's a little one-shot example of the learn drunk, test drunk philosophy. And this is basically state-dependent learning is the theory. Another set of experiments that looked at actually memory, and there's a whole series of these, and I already mentioned one of these, and that was the professor's office study. And memory is reconstructive based on expectation. And again, the idea of how does memory work? And most people have this belief that their memory is fairly photographic. Even if we have bad memory, we never question our memories. We figure that they've got to be right. And if you can probably think of multiple times in your life where you've gotten into an argument with a close friend, a loved one, a parent, someone you're in a relationship with, where both of you are remembering the same event and you're remembering it very differently. You're always sure that your memory version of it is right and theirs is wrong. I actually started to secretly record my mom when I was a teenager because of this effect, because I knew that I should be winning every argument, and she always was saying that things happen differently than I remember them. But when I actually recorded one of our arguments, and then weeks or discussions, and then weeks later we had an argument about it, I went to my room very sure that I was going to be able to prove my mom wrong, and I listened to the secret audio tape I made. Turned out neither of us was right. Both of us had made, our memories had shifted a little bit to fit our own preconceptions. And based on this phenomenon, the first one, memory is reconstructive based on expectations, is the study I already talked about. That is the professor's office study. But that led the researchers to also ask, how powerful is this? And they actually started to ask, are there cases where people could even be convinced they're guilty when they're not, especially in very stressful situations? And what they were really, this was basically right at the start of genetic testing. And what was being found out was that by going back and testing genetic evidence, they were actually finding that some people who had admitted, in other words, they had basically pled guilty to a crime, could not have committed the crime based on the genetic evidence. In other words, someone else had done it because they weren't the ones that actually had left the DNA evidence. And this led the researchers to go, how hard would it be for us to basically convince people they're guilty? And what they did is they set up an experiment where they basically had someone come in and do a computer task, and the computer was rigged to either basically give the blue screen of death or not. And they were told prior to doing the experiment, whatever you do, don't hit this combination of buttons. It causes the computer to crash. So in half the experiments, in every example of the experiment, the computer would crash. Now, none of the people had actually ever hit that combination of buttons. But when the researchers came back in, the conditions were, one, they simply asked the person if they did it. If they said no, they said fine, and they let them go. The other condition is they actually basically used police techniques to actually question the person for 20 minutes or 40 minutes. Now, very few people actually ever admitted to doing it. Everyone in all three conditions basically said they didn't do it. But here's the catch. A week later, they actually brought the people back in and basically just debriefed them and asked them what they remember. The people that had not been interrogated at all still insisted they hadn't done it. The people that had moderate interrogation, about 20% of them actually now said, you know, the more I think about it, the more I might have hit those numbers. And in the intense interrogation condition, about 40% reported, I think I actually did it. Now again, we know for a fact they had video cameras. No one ever hit that combination of buttons. Now you could make the argument in this experiment, well, of course they had said they might have done it because there was no cost. They weren't going to have to go to prison. But this was also just an example of something that has already been seen in the real world, people admitting to crimes they haven't committed. And it turns out it's pretty easy to actually get people to think they may have done something they didn't do. Now, if you think about a particular suspect who was drunk or confused at the time they're being accused, they may start second guessing. I don't fully remember that night. Maybe I did do it. And they go ahead and admit to guilt when they weren't actually guilty.